Many people believe that Apollo 11 moon landing is the most iconic moment in human space age. Many kids at the time watching the Apollo 11 moon landing were inspired and became the future scientists to advance human space developments to new heights. But I disagree. I think the most important event in our desire to go to space involved a satellite the size of a beach ball. This satellite is probably the single reason why the US has started to pursue space travel in a serious manner and with urgency. And in many ways, this satellite is directly responsible for the creation of NASA. This tiny satellite called Sputnik was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957, and it successfully orbited the Earth. And it sent a radio signal to Earth as it was orbiting, and this is what it sounded like. Before Sputnik, space travel was not at the top of the priority list for the US, but after Sputnik, fearing that the Soviet Union now could have the ability to launch missiles from space, the US Defense Department immediately increased funding and created the satellite project called the Explorer. But before the US could reply to the Soviet Union with their own satellite in orbit, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2 just a month after Sputnik 1. Sputnik 2 was a much bigger spacecraft than its predecessor, and it also contained the first living being to ever go into orbit around the Earth. That being a female dog called Lika. Other living beings were sent to space in the past, but never into an actual orbit. The first animal to go into space were fruit flies. They were sent by the US in 1947. The reason they picked fruit flies was because they have a lot in common with humans in terms of genetic code, especially the gene structure responsible for diseases. The first mammal in space was a monkey, also sent by the US. But these missions did not involve the spacecraft getting into orbit. Majority of these space-related tests by the US were done using the missile rockets created by the Germans during World War II. What had happened was that after the war, the US had taken a lot of these advanced missiles along with the man who created these missiles. His name, Wernher von Braun. He was a key figure in helping the US compete with the Soviet Union. On one hand, the Soviet Union was experimenting with dogs, and on the other, the US was using monkeys. But on Sputnik 2, Lika became the first ever to go into orbit. There was a separate sealed cabin for Lika, which provided food in a gel form, water, and oxygen. There was enough space for her to stand or lie down. At the time of Sputnik 2, humans had never returned a spacecraft back to Earth safely from an orbit, and so there was no intent of bringing Lika back on Earth. The plan was to put Lika into orbit, get some data on how living organisms behave while orbiting in space, and after 10 days, Lika's oxygen would run out. However, due to a problem on board the spacecraft, the temperature inside the spacecraft increased significantly, rising above 40 degrees Celsius, and because of this intense heat, it is estimated that she probably survived only for a day or two. But the Soviet Union did not release this information at the time. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union had put an animal into orbit while the US was still struggling to put a spacecraft into orbit. Due to the increased funding and increasing pressure of falling behind the Soviet Union, in December 1957, 1 month after Sputnik 2, the US was finally ready to launch their own satellite into space. This would prove that the US had not fallen behind the Soviet Union in its space technology development. The US wanted the entire world to witness this, and so they did extensive media coverage of the launch, and this is what happened. Next morning, newspapers were calling the event Flopnik. Usually after a launch failure, scientists step back and reevaluate the entire situation as they don't want to rush things and cause another failure, as space travel is extremely expensive. But this was an exception. The US needed to prove to the world and to their own citizens, who were now doubting their country's ability after the Flopnik incident. In a month's time, the US launched its first successful satellite into Earth's orbit.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire command. Fire command. Think of it. Think of
it. Minutes click past relentlessly. The beams of powerful searchlights light up the missile. Truly the star of one of the greatest suspense dramas of our time.
And this started the space race between the then two dominating nations in the world. And to stay in the competition, towards the end of 1958, NASA was created. And since then, NASA's contribution to space research and development has been insurmountable.
0 and liftoff, the final liftoff of Atlantis.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.